On the night of March 15th, 1847, peace itself split open in Virginia. It began as a sound, an unnatural scream tearing through the stillness of Cumberland County. A scream no one in those rolling farmlands could explain. The locals, hardened by the commonplace miseries of antebellum life, knew all its familiar noises. They had heard the bellows of cattle wrenched from the slaughterhouse. They had heard the desperate wails of enslaved mothers giving birth under conditions that stripped the miracle of life down to exhaustion and pain. They had heard the drunken shouting of overseers, the snapping crack of the whip, the hushed tears swallowed in fields so their owners could not hear. But this was something different. Witnesses described it in fragments, because how does one find words for a sound that seems to crawl beneath the skin? Some said it was part human, part animal, high-pitched enough to curdle blood, low enough to shake the chest. Others swore it carried not just volume, but intention, like whoever unleashed it wanted the whole countryside to know. In the nearby woods, dogs fell silent. Birds that usually fussed in spring branches seemed to vanish into the night. The very air carried unease. Neighbors looked up from their porches, hearts quickening without knowing why. Candle flames in great plantation houses flickered and spit wax as if recoiling. By dawn, Cumberland County would discover the origin of that scream, and the discovery was so horrific, so impossible, that the event refused to stay confined to that single night. Whispers would carry it down roads and rivers, into Richmond parlors and court records, then buried under decades of silence, only to resurface when secrets were no longer safe. The story, when uncovered, was so unthinkable that many doubted a human hand could have performed it. And yet, the evidence was carved into flesh, arranged with a precision no ghost ever achieved. This was not merely a murder. This was the night when Isaac stepped out of obscurity, leaving behind terror so profound it rippled across a society already choking on its own contradictions. What happened at a sprawling estate called Peaton Grove would sear itself into Virginia's hidden history, and at its center stood a man who was both enslaved and unstoppable. Only one name survived the horror intact, carried by terrified tongues for generations afterward: Isaac. But history would not remember him as simply Isaac. History gave him a darker name, whispered with awe and dread alike: Isaac the Butcher. Spring of 1847 had arrived in Virginia, and with it the deceptive loveliness of the land. To a visitor cresting the hills of Cumberland County, the scene would have appeared idyllic. The James River cut a slow, glinting path through fertile country where great tracts of tobacco shimmered like green quilts sewn across the valleys. Red clay earth fed thousands of acres, its bounty destined for markets as far away as England. The scent of tilled soil mixed with new buds of magnolia and honeysuckle, saturating the air with the sweetness of prosperity. On porches, shaded by white-pillared verandas, men in waistcoats discussed commerce and politics. Women guided their children through polished lessons, ensuring they could recite their manners as fluently as scripture. Horses clattered over dirt lanes as neighbors rode out to visit one another, the wheels of carriages flashing in the sunlight. Everything in Cumberland County suggested stability, wealth, and the careful rituals of southern gentility. But beneath that well-oiled facade stretched the truth. The apparent orderliness of society rested on a foundation of human bondage. For every shimmering field there were dozens of men and women bent double in rows of crop, backs stiff from ceaseless toil. For every polished dinner table in a planter's house, there were enslaved cooks spending hours sweating over iron pots, their hands scarred black by flames. For every silver cup passed at a gathering, enslaved boys and girls ran barefoot on splintered floors, unseen except when needed for service. The contradictions were everywhere, undeniable if one chose to look. A harp's music floated from a drawing room, while outside, a man was whipped into silence. Plans for Sunday worship in grand churches mingled with the thrum of chains rattling across auction blocks in Richmond. The genteel world believed in the permanence of their system, calling it order. But any order that could hold only through violence already trembled like crystal in a careless hand. It was into this world, so polished on its surface, so cruel beneath, that the story of Isaac took its shape. The communities of Cumberland trusted their routines. Tobacco seasons followed patterns. Plantation hierarchies ran like clockwork. Wealth stacked itself in order, drawing the eye upward to great homes, family names, distinguished reputations. But if one turned the gaze downward instead, deep into quarters and cabins, into slaughterhouses scented of iron and blood, one might glimpse another pattern developing, one not of wealth, but of survival, and of very quiet resistance. That spring, the wealthy residents of Cumberland basked in their prosperity, ignorant of the fact that one of the most terrifying figures in American history was about to rise from their own backyards. The scream that had broken the silence would soon reveal itself as more than sound. It was a crack in the fiction of their world, proof that beneath the polished order of Virginia, chaos had been building, quiet and calculated, clothed in human form. And chaos had a name. If Cumberland County was a stage upon which contradictions strutted, then Peaton Grove was one of its grandest backdrops. The estate sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres, prime Virginia soil that had passed through 3 generations of pitons since the 1760s. Its rolling fields of tobacco and corn, its herds of cattle and hogs, and its rows of enslaved laborers bent over each task told the story of one thing: money and the continuity wealth buys. The main house itself stood like a declaration of permanence. Built on the soft rise of a hill, it towered 3 stories high, crowned with stately white columns across its front porch. Verandas wrapped around its angles, where breezes played with lace curtains and carried the faint smell of tobacco curing in distant barns. Travelers approaching on horseback often remarked that Peaton Grove seemed to watch over its land. To neighbors, it symbolized Cornelius Peaton's control over not just soil, but people. Cornelius, grandson of Josiah Peaton, who had built the estate, was a man in his early 40s. He cultivated his reputation as a shrewd tobacco baron with sharp grey eyes that surveyed estate books as keenly as they surveyed human beings. His hair had turned silver long before his peers, though he carried it as though it were a badge of superiority. Unlike many of his planter neighbors, who relied heavily on hired overseers, Cornelius relished exercising direct control. It wasn't efficiency exactly. It was pride, a desire to show that every figure, every hog, every enslaved worker bent at his command. He believed order was the highest principle of life, but order in his definition meant obedience. His books neat, his household running smoothly, his fields heavy with labor, not his own. Margaret, his wife, was the daughter of a distinguished Richmond banking family. Her upbringing had been steeped in piano lessons, silver etiquette, and polished dinner parties. Now, as mistress of Peaton Grove, she occupied the role of graceful hostess. Those who met her often remarked on her composure and her taste for delicate crafts, particularly flower arranging and embroidery. Yet an undercurrent of tension ran beneath her hospitality. Neighbors observed her nerves, the way her smile lingered a touch too long, or her gaze flitted when Cornelius spoke. A woman in charge of social graces in public, but perhaps not of her private happiness. The Peaton children completed the portrait of antebellum privilege. Samuel, the eldest at 22, mirrored his father's exacting demeanor. Tall and broad-shouldered, Samuel studied bookkeeping and business with the intention of carrying the Peaton fortune into the next generation. His father called him disciplined, others found him cold. Elizabeth, 19, stood somewhere between girlhood and the expectations of marriage. Letters to a Richmond friend described her frustration at the confinements of plantation life. Her parents, however, boasted of her talent on harp and needlework. Thomas, only 16, still bore the careless arrogance of youth. He raced horses across fields. He flirted with overseers' daughters. Some admired his wild charm. Others whispered that such recklessness left untamed would tarnish his family's legacy. Mary, their youngest, only 12, was a child caught in a gilded cage. Too young to feel the full weight of her family's system, too sheltered to know anything different. She trailed behind Elizabeth and practiced spelling words at her small desk by the nursery window. The household stretched further still. Cornelius's elderly mother, Prudence, at 78, kept a sharp watch on the residents despite her bent back. Age had not softened her severity. She embodied the stern matriarch who long believed the family's order must extend to every brick of Peaton Grove. Alongside her lived Catherine, Margaret's unmarried sister, who after their father's death found herself folded into the Peaton household. Catherine was quiet, sometimes overlooked, often present at Margaret's side in domestic duties, but rarely at the center of attention. Finally, there was Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Jonathan Pemberton, a practicing physician. Trained in Philadelphia before returning to the Virginia countryside, he resided frequently at the estate. His presence lent Peaton Grove the mark of refinement, a family not just of wealth but learning. Jonathan posed as contrast to Cornelius. He was less stern, more reflective, but loyal to family all the same. He treated the illnesses of enslaved workers and planters alike, often remarking in his journals on how disease respected no one. Still, his medical eye could notice detail others ignored, and this quiet habit of observation would later make him the first witness to signs of something unspeakable. Peaton Grove was more than a home. It was a machine of order, each person a cog designed to keep its routines churning. The gardens bloomed when Margaret oversaw them. The ledgers balanced when Cornelius reviewed them. The tutors came and went on schedule to drill Latin into the children. Every supper was carefully laid, every light extinguished on time. To neighbors, the Peatons represented a Virginia family at its pinnacle, wealthy, educated, rooted in land, commanding respect. Yet within their orderly household lay invisible frictions: Cornelius's pride, Margaret's tight composure, Samuel's arrogance, Elizabeth's restlessness, each small crack still hidden to outside eyes. And into this house of order soon enough Isaac would step. If Peaton Grove's splendor looked immovable, its tobacco fields, its polished parlors, its family lineage, then the arrival of one man in the autumn of 1844 began the smallest but sharpest fracture in its order. His entry hardly looked like history at first. He came not as guest or noble, but as property, a man purchased with little fanfare, folded into the Peatons' workforce like tool or animal. Yet, unlike others, he carried with him a reputation whispered from one county to the next. Cornelius Peaton had acquired Isaac from Fielding Crawford of neighboring Prince Edward County. Crawford, eager to complete the transaction, accepted nearly 30% less than Isaac's assessed value. That alone puzzled other planters. Tobacco lords rarely discounted enslaved people with useful trades, especially one like Isaac. The deal carried conditions unusual enough to deepen suspicions. Cornelius was instructed never to sell Isaac back into Prince Edward County. One planter allegedly muttered over supper, "When a man sells a skilled laborer at a loss, you can be sure he's buying a night's peace for himself." Isaac was unlike the ordinary laborers of Virginia. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his build marked with wide shoulders and massive hands that looked even larger against his wiry frame. His skin bore no readily noticeable scars of lash or labor, though his muscles spoke of power. What unsettled most, however, were his eyes. A pale, nearly colorless gray, they seemed to take light rather than reflect it. Overseers muttered they found it difficult to meet his gaze, even when Isaac said nothing. And silence was his companion. He spoke sparingly, never squandering words. Some thought him slow to talk because he carried little thought. Others guessed the opposite, that he listened for more than he spoke. Enslaved workers noted the way he would stand at distances, studying without need to act. His silence was not passivity, it was observation. Though his words were few, his skills were clear. Isaac's trade was the slaughterhouse. From the age of youth, he had been marked for the work of dressing livestock. But Isaac's trade, as his former owner admitted in correspondence, was more than a skill. It was a talent almost disturbing in its mastery. He could reduce a hog in half the time of other men, slicing it apart with surgical exactness. Not a joint misplaced, not a tendon wasted, not a scrap of meat spoiled. Cow or sheep, hog or goat, his knife never faltered. He knew where the arteries lay, how to free organs without bursting them, how to strip flesh without effort. His knowledge seemed less learned as craft than absorbed as art. Workers whispered he could do it faster than you could blink, and somehow without a drop of blood staining his clothes. It was whispered, too, that Isaac treated his knives with military devotion. Each had its place, each was honed to gleaming perfection, each handled with care that bordered on affection. In his slaughterhouse, tools hung like soldiers on parade. Fielding Crawford's eagerness to sell was not fully written in contracts, but in whispers. There were stories of cattle found slain, not simply butchered but arranged, limbs positioned as though to make patterns no farmer could profit from. Goats pieced apart ornamentally, chickens lined in symmetrical rows, not as preparation but as experiments. A farmhand claimed to have found Isaac standing motionless over a carcass long after his butchery was complete, his shirt spotless white despite the gore that should have stained every fold. Another swore that Isaac had once taken apart a hog so swiftly and cleanly that it looked untouched from the outside, until its very bones fell neatly into a pile at his feet. Could this be dismissed as superstition? Perhaps. But when Cornelius acquired him, he believed what most planters believed, that Isaac may have been strange, but he was also a bargain. A man who could keep Peaton Grove's slaughterhouse efficient would be worth the neighbors' gossip. And for nearly 3 years, nothing outwardly disturbed routine. Isaac worked alone, by preference, in a sturdy brick slaughterhouse set apart from the main house. Within its cool, thick walls, he arranged every knife, every cleaver, every stone, precisely. It was always eerily clean. Too clean, some thought. One overseer muttered, "There's not enough blood in that place for the work that's done there." Quietly, steadily, Isaac became part of the rhythm of Peaton Grove. He managed the butchering of livestock for family consumption, prepared meat for sales to neighboring properties, salted hams for the winter smokehouse. He troubled no one. He asked no questions. He never drank, never gambled, never quarreled. But to those who paid attention, he seemed to trouble everyone. His gaze too steady, his silence too sharp, his presence too much like a shadow slipped into the corner of a candle-lit room. Never doing violence, but always hinting that violence was near. The Pitons considered him a useful, if peculiar, addition. Neighbors remained unconvinced. They said men who cut so cleanly and looked with eyes so pale were not meant to be trusted with knives or with people. And on the morning of March 15th, 1847, the day that scream would crack Virginia wide open, those lingering whispers would unfurl into dreadful certainty. Peaton Grove had welcomed into its order the one figure most suited to unravel it piece by piece, like carcass from bone. His name was Isaac, but history would remember that arrival by a darker title: Isaac the Butcher. The morning of March 15th, 1847 began like so many before on Peaton Grove, measured in routine, wrapped in the illusion of permanence. The sky had carried the clarity of early spring, fresh with the scent of new tobacco seedlings. In the kitchen garden, Margaret Peaton directed the enslaved women as they turned earthbeds for seasonal vegetables. From her position, she could see the household servants ferrying baskets to the smokehouse, every step a stitch in the quilt of her daily command. In the schoolroom, the Peaton children bent over their lessons with Professor Aldrich, the precise tutor imported from Richmond to ensure their manners and Latin conjugations outpaced their neighbors. Samuel pored over accounts with the pride of future mastery. Elizabeth let her sighs escape only onto the margins of her copybook. Thomas doodled sketches of horses where equations should have been, and Mary's head tilted dreamily toward the garden outside. Cornelius, as always, was in his study. He scribbled across ledgers, reviewing letters from Richmond factors. Business consumed him. The previous year's tobacco sales had been high, and this year promised even better returns. He believed this might be the year that secured Peaton Grove's unmatched profitability, a banner to wave above all rival planters. Even Isaac had his usual place, unseen but not unfelt. His slaughterhouse in the brick outbuilding, cool, thick-walled, unnervingly immaculate, must have hummed with sharpened knives and his steady silence. He preferred solitude, and he was granted it. The family did not trouble themselves with the details of his work. They simply trusted the meats would be ready, salted, hung, or smoked precisely when expected. All seemed ordinary. But ordinariness is fragile. It shatters quickly when something gnaws beneath the surface. It was Dr. Jonathan Peaton, Cornelius's younger brother, the physician, who first sensed unease. He had ridden into the estate the previous night intending to check on enslaved laborers with influenza. His plan that morning was simple: visit the quarters after dawn, treat their lingering fevers, then ride out to the next patient. Yet, as midday crept near, the grounds felt subdued. Jonathan noticed the absence first. The usual chatter and rustle of enslaved children near the cabins was subdued. No ring of tools against stone, no song carried over fields to soften labor. Silence reigned too heavily. Approaching the slave quarters, expecting to find coughing, sneezing patients, he instead caught something worse. A scent. Not the ordinary musk of sweat, clay, or hearth smoke, but sharp, metallic, penetrating. The smell of blood. Another detail sharpened as he approached. The door of Isaac's cabin stood ajar. That alone was remarkable. Isaac guarded his privacy jealously, his door always shut, windows covered. The faint creak of that open door in the breeze felt out of place, like a smile on a corpse's face. Then Jonathan saw it. The stains, dark, rusty streaks across the threshold's edge, crusted against the grain of wood. His medical training told him instantly: blood, not hours, but nearly a day past fresh. His stomach fluttered with dread. He called inward once, quietly. "Isaac?" No answer. Only air thick with the iron tang of blood and the oppressive stillness of a room not meant to be entered. He pushed the door wide. What he saw tangled his physician's sense with primal terror. The cabin's Spartan simplicity had been disturbed with terrifying order. Items that once belonged to Isaac, cloth, tools, small trinkets, were now placed with geometric precision, laid out as though arranged by compass. A pair of boots equidistant under the cot, a wooden bowl perfectly centered on a crude table, a piece of folded cloth squared into sharp angles without wrinkle, and above it all, hanging from the wooden rafters, swayed forms that turned the doctor's blood cold. At first his mind identified them as animal carcasses, sides of pork or beef strung temptingly the way slaughterhouses preserve meats against the heat, but as his eyes adjusted, recognition seared his mind. These were not hogs, not cattle, not anything with hooves or hide. These were human remains. Arms, torsos, limbs, suspended like specimens in a butcher's dream. Joints cleaved with surgical clarity. Organs absent, as though carefully removed, dissected not in haste, but in professional study. The lines of every cut mirrored what Jonathan himself might attempt in a medical procedure, but here they were clinical with no hint of mercy. The doctor staggered backward against the doorway. Fear surged, but so did observation, each incision clean, crisp, exact. Whoever had performed these dissections had not flailed in frenzy, but guided his blade as though following a map. And dread whispered its answer. Only one man at Piton Grove could cut this way. Isaac. Shaken, Jonathan fled the cabin, lungs knotted with panic. Yet as he crossed the grounds, he realized another strangling wrongness. The entire estate was too still. No sound of the enslaved toiling, no roosters crowing, no chatter spilling from children, not even Bessie, the old healer, humming as she brewed her tinctures. The estate breathed absence. He stumbled toward the main house in desperate hope that what he'd glimpsed in Isaac's private quarters did not extend further, but the details stacked like bricks of terror. The front door, ajar, careless. Margaret never let such slip, especially at noon. The smell of prepared food crept faintly outward, a meal abandoned mid-prep. Jonathan's voice cracked the quiet. Cornelius? Margaret? Samuel? The answers came only from silence. Each step deeper into the mansion drew Jonathan closer to the truth. Rooms bore signs of lives interrupted. The dining table set and steaming plates left to cool. Margaret's embroidery needle dropped mid-stitch, its thread trailing like a frozen gesture. Children's toys scattered, arranged not in play, but as though frozen in time. Then, at the base of the stairs, Jonathan saw it, a dark trail of stains across the carpet. Blood dragged upward. Something heavy pulled up to the second floor. His fists clenched, his heart thundered. He would climb, he would learn the truth. And on those stairs, moving toward his brother's study, Jonathan was about to open the door into one of the most unthinkable stages of horror ever carved in Virginia. The story of Isaac was no longer whisper. Isaac was writing his tale in flesh. The air thickened as Dr. Jonathan Piton climbed the staircase. Each step pressed against his chest as though the house itself resisted his ascent. The blood trail along the carpet seemed deliberate, dark stains not splattered wildly but drawn upward in steady measure, like a guide rope leading him into nightmare. At the top of the stairs he paused, his hand trembling against the mahogany railing. Ahead lay his brother's private study. Its door was ajar, shoulders of light spilling out, as though inviting him in. Jonathan's training as a doctor fortified him. He had seen corpses, delivered news of death, stitched gruesome wounds. But nothing in his career prepared him for what waited behind that door. Cornelius Piton still sat at his desk. At first glance he seemed alive, pen in hand, shoulders squared, his ledger open before him, as if he were reviewing figures in mid-sentence. His posture was calm, not slumped, but his head was gone. Placed carefully, reverently, it sat upon the desk itself, facing outward, pale grey eyes fixed in eternal confrontation. The angle was not sloppy, not careless. It was posed, arranged. His body showed no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no overturned chair to signal resistance. One moment alive, the next, his throat had opened in a line so clean it defied imagination. Jonathan knew no man in the county, but Isaac had hands steady enough to cut like that. The head, like an ink bottle or ledger book, was just another object in Cornelius's workspace. Far more chilling than death was the absence of violence. The room was neat. His brother's murder had been not an act of rage, but an act of composition. Jonathan staggered from the study, bursting into other rooms, desperate to find survivors. Instead, his horror multiplied. Every member of the household had been murdered, but their deaths echoed an aesthetic design. Margaret Petton had been found in the bedroom, hands outstretched toward a vase of fresh flowers, but her head was missing from her shoulders. It had been placed upright among the flowers, gazing out from petals in unnatural bloom. The effect struck Jonathan like blasphemy. A domestic act, the arranging of blossoms, fused with surgical violence. Chet, Mary, Elizabeth, Thomas and Samuel were discovered together in the nursery. Their bodies sat comfortably as though engaged in a children's game, a ring circle on the carpet. Their heads, however, had been placed in the center, facing one another, silent mouths shaped as if they were conversing. It was the frozen simulation of play, turned into grotesque charade. Prudence, the grandmother, still rested in her rocking chair on the back porch. Her stiff hands clutched her Bible, spectacles perched on the table beside her, but her severed head sat placed neatly beside those spectacles, as though she had gently dozed off on the scripture and would wake again. Catherine, Margaret's sister, had been killed in the kitchen, a loaf of bread half prepared before her. Her head rested upon the cutting board where she'd worked, as if she herself had become the final ingredient in her own daily industry. Across the mansion, repetition screamed the same message. These killings were not to eliminate, but to display. What terrified Jonathan beyond the sheer massacre was the inexplicable cleanliness. He knew the results of human violence, the splatter, the pool, the mess. Here, none. The hallways remained shockingly neat, polished wood untouched. The linens on the beds were unsoiled. Even the carpets, hand-woven from England, remained untarnished, save for faint, dragging stains. It was as if Isaac had bled every victim elsewhere, perhaps in his slaughterhouse, then transported each corpse back to the house, meticulously posed like an artist setting sculpture. Jonathan, scientist and doctor, strained to deny what his eyes saw. Logic offered no relief. A crime of rage splatters chaos, but this was measured calm. Isaac had curated death like a gallery. Jonathan inspected wounds by instinct, though his body begged him to flee. Each victim's neck bore the same signature, a single slice, cut from behind with impossible precision. Arteries severed in a stroke so efficient, death would have been instant. No flinch, no chance to scream. At least no scream until it was far too late. He found no defensive wounds on hands or arms, nothing to suggest the victims had even faced their executioner. The conclusion came with dreadful clarity. Isaac had approached each victim in silence, perhaps with a trust-only proximity allowed, delivered his kill instantaneously, then arranged the corpse into scenes both intimate and monstrous. Jonathan's knees weakened as he staggered back into the hallway. He no longer moved as a physician cataloguing injuries. He gasped like a man drowning, his voice caught in broken sobs, echoing faintly off polished wood. Had he truly witnessed this? His family, disassembled not in madness, but in expression. The air in the mansion seemed to thicken. He imagined Isaac not as runaway fugitive, but still lingering in some shadowed corner, pale eyes fixed on him. He dropped his gaze to his trembling hands, wondering if he'd escape alive long enough to report what evil genius had lived in their fields disguised as servant. It was only in stumbling backward through the parlor that he saw the detail that forced the question burning in his mind. Was Isaac solely a butcher, or something far stranger? On the hearth by Margaret's embroidery frame, a length of silk thread trailed faintly upward, tied not to fabric, but to a small brass token, a strange mark etched upon it, an artifact that Jonathan would later learn was Isaac's true confession. Not a hasty signature, but a symbol left deliberately, almost like an artist signing a masterpiece. The meaning of that symbol would not be clear until investigators pried open floorboards in Isaac's cabin and found his journals. But in that moment, one thing resounded over Jonathan's panicked, racing mind. Isaac had not murdered for convenience. He had not murdered for freedom. He had butchered, dismembered, arranged and signed, because for him, death itself was canvas. By dawn on March 16, 1847, Peaton Grove no longer belonged to its namesake family. It belonged to the investigation, lawmen, neighbors, riders summoned by Jonathan's frantic midnight dash to Cumberland Courthouse. The mansion that once symbolized order and gentility now stood as a gallery of violation, its dreadful displays forcing even hardened men to falter at its threshold. Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne arrived first, a veteran of 20 years in law enforcement. He had seen crimes of passion, robberies, even uprisings of enslaved people struck down with violence. But as he dismounted before the lavish columns, an uncharacteristic reluctance sank in his chest. Inside, the odor of iron drifted faintly, blood without spatter, an antiseptic eeriness that clung to the nostrils. 2 deputies followed, their boots heavy with dread. And behind them came Coroner William Fitzgerald, medical bag in hand, a man whose profession demanded skepticism, but who muttered prayers under his breath as he crossed the threshold. Together, they toured what Jonathan had glimpsed, and though he had struggled to believe his own eyes, their voices now confirmed it. These were not hallucinations of a terrified mind. Each room presented itself as carefully prepared scenes of domestic life, perverted into grotesque still lifes. In the dining room, dishes cooled on porcelain, knives and forks laid gently beside plates. Yet beside one, a human head had been placed upright, as though conversation had paused only long enough for death to arrive. In the nursery, the circle of children's bodies and severed heads made the deputies weep openly. Their youth, arranged in parody of innocent games, mocked the very purpose of play. In the parlor, Margaret's embroidery remained intact, the trailing thread stitched not into fabric but into death itself, bound to the brass token, Isaac's silent flourish. Outside on the porch, Prudence's posed corpse rocked gently in a breeze, her spectacles folded neatly beside her as though she were still part of a living routine. Sheriff Hawthorne, Coroner Fitzgerald, and grieving Jonathan stood in silence after each room. Even hardened men could not bring words to what logic told them they witnessed. "This is not rage," Fitzgerald whispered at last. "This is order." Fitzgerald knelt by bodies, examining wounds and cloth. He confirmed the uncanny detail Jonathan had seen, no defensive wounds, and cuts impossibly precise. "All from behind," the coroner murmured, tracing a fingertip just above a jawline. A long blade, sharp beyond measure. One stroke. Their pulses stopped before they even understood what touched them. "And the blood?" asked Hawthorne, boot heel tapping against unmarred carpet. "Where's the blood gone, Doctor?" "Gone indeed. No streaks smeared the walls, no pools soaked into rugs, no arterial spray littered whitewashed plaster. Instead, each corpse seemed drained, as if blood had been drawn from it carefully before arrangement. Fitzgerald pressed a palm against a body and flinched. Still warm, flesh alive in color hours beyond death, no pooling in limbs. The blood has been removed. Hawthorne looked at Jonathan with a haunted stare. "That's not a killing," he said, voice low. "That's butchery with a surgeon's discipline." And though he needn't name the culprit, every man in the room already whispered it inwardly. Isaac. Yet for all their evidence of the killer, there was one unbearable truth. Isaac himself was gone. His cabin, already disturbed by Jonathan's entry, yielded only more horror. Human remains strung like livestock, tools in pristine rows. The journals beneath loose floorboards, nearly missed at first, sat waiting like confessions disguised in ink. But no man, no fugitive, no footsteps churned into mud, gave chaseable clue to his travels. Isaac had left nothing but silence behind. 3 additional enslaved people, missing at dawn, briefly shifted suspicion. Moses, as Sarah and Peter, all unaccounted for. Yet, as searches extended into barns, gardens, and the slaughterhouse, their answer came brutally. Each body discovered posed in the same signature style, heads severed, positioned neatly. Moses in his cabin bed as though peacefully at rest, Sarah in the garden among the very vegetables she had tended, Peter in the slaughterhouse, tools stacked as if he had been diligently cleaning. All killed like the family, all arranged. Thus Isaac stood alone as actor, mastermind, and phantom, a man of silence who overnight had proven more destructive than any uprising or revolt the South feared in whispers. To Sheriff Hawthorne, the implications tightened like a noose. A single enslaved man had executed not only his owners but 14 souls in total, without alarm, without mess, with expertise surpassing trained physicians. Plantation society's order was revealed fragile, penetrable, the curtain of gentility ripped to prove the stage beneath was built on bones. The sheriff muttered bitterly, "I have buried men after Indian raids. I have seen what a musket ball does in war. But this is not war. This is something I cannot name." Yet one thing could be named. The journals hinted it. The brass token hinted it. Even Isaac's silence announced it. He had not killed from sudden violence. He had authored a message out of death, and with Isaac vanished into the woods of Virginia, perhaps still holding pristine knives in those massive hands, the sheriff realized. This horror was no finale. It was an overture. By evening, word had spread among neighbors. The Peton massacre traveled faster than horse hooves could carry it. Whispers gathered weight as gossip shifted to myth. Some spoke of Isaac as demon rather than man. Others whispered he was possessed of supernatural calm. Mothers ushered children indoors. Planters locked their doors, something to, never before considered. But Isaac was not supernatural. He was not ghost. He was something more terrifying. A man whose knowledge and patience had crossed into art. The writings found in his cabin would reveal soon enough that what Isaac had done at Peton Grove was not an accident of rage, but a rehearsal for something greater. And so Cumberland County trembled under its new knowledge, that even in the heart of order, a single man could unwrite it in silence, that a butcher's tools, guided by intellect, could scatter a dynasty into echoes. History had birthed a phantom from the very soil it claimed was civilized. His name was Isaac, but now dread reshaped it across every tongue in Virginia. From farmhouse to courthouse, they whispered it alike. Isaac the Butcher. When the sheriff's men pried loose the floorboards of Isaac's cabin, they expected to find coin, tools, or perhaps the remnants of stolen items. Instead, they uncovered what might be called the soul of the butcher, or more precisely, his mind preserved in ink. There were multiple volumes, dated and ordered, their bindings crude but their contents shocking in precision. The handwriting, in careful, educated script, excluded any notion that Isaac was ignorant property. His penmanship carried the steady discipline of a trained student, almost identical to the copybooks of colleges and medical schools. The earliest entries dated from October 1844, mere weeks after his arrival at Peaton Grove. At first, the journals resembled a simple chronicle. Isaac kept meticulous notes of daily life, charting meal times, work schedules, patterns of the Peaton children, Cornelius's financial routines, Margaret's gardening hours. He recorded the weather, the sounds of house creaks, even which floorboards betrayed footsteps in the night. It read less like diary and more like surveillance, a man who treated the household and its residents as subjects under study. His tone was detached, nearly scientific. At 7:15, Cornelius opened his Hutters. At 7:18, he rang for water. He prefers silence before speaking his first word of the day. Another entry. The grandmother finds comfort in rocking on the porch at dusk. She does not perceive movement behind her when the sun blinds her vision. There was no malice in these observations, but neither was there warmth. The family lived, ate, breathed, and slept under the gaze of a silent anatomist cataloguing their existences. Over months, these entries grew more unnerving. Isaac began experiments in disruption. He notes, for instance, nudging Margaret's vase 6 inches left upon the mantel, then recording her response. She felt unease, recognizing something wrong, but was unable to name it. To Isaac, this was not trivial. It was data. Environment shifted. Subject sensed change without perceiving cause. Frustration lingered in subject's expression. He described nightly vigils, listening to the breathing patterns of the household, memorizing which stair treads groaned beneath weight, which doors could be opened noiselessly, which hinges betrayed with squeak. Later notes detailed tests, slipping a door open by fractions over multiple nights to judge whether Samuel or Elizabeth stirred in their sleep. It was as though he were rehearsing, perfecting the choreography of moving through life unseen. Beyond household observation, the journals also contained sketches, disturbingly precise illustrations of human skeletons, musculature, and organ systems. These were not crude attempts but detailed studies resembling anatomical charts from medical textbooks. Muscle groups shaded, vertebrae labeled, the placement of arteries drawn with familiarity. Beside them, Isaac scribbled notes. Carotid can be parted fully in less than a second with proper angle. Location behind ear useful for precise insertion. Blood ceases quickly if incision clean. No enslaved slaughter hand should have possessed such knowledge. His illustrations and terminology bespoke formal training far beyond what any plantation butcher's block could grant. Most chilling of all was how his entries progressed. The early writings were the notes of an observer. The later ones darkened into the plans of a designer. He began referring to arrangements. He sketched rough diagrams of rooms in the Peaton house, notating where family members tended to stand, where their belongings usually rested. He plotted arrows of entry and escape, diagrams of where bodies might later be placed. He rehearsed with words the actions of a final night. Subject will sit at desk, remove head, place upright, maintain posture to preserve image of daily order. Child subjects, arrange in circle to mimic game gesture. Matriarch on porch, place beside spectacles for symbolic continuity. The massacre, investigators realized, had been preconceived not in rage, but detail. The arrangement of the dead was not improvisation. It had been finalized like an architect completing blueprints. In his final entries leading toward March of 1847, Isaac no longer wrote as observer or even planner. He wrote as artist. He described his intentions not as killings but studies of mortality, compositions, and in one chilling entry, an exploration of the aesthetic potential of cessation. The human body, in his framing, was raw material for art in death as much as meat was material for use in life. He referred to his plan as a final experiment. He would, as if in service to some hidden theory, reorder life into a portrait of death that proved its beauty when stripped of blood, stripped of struggle, and arranged by skilled hand. More terrifying still, he hinted at peers, disciples, fellow artists of anatomy, individuals with whom he claimed correspondence. His words blurred. Were they real collaborators or figments of a fevered mind? No answer was conclusive. Sheriff Hawthorne, raising one such journal page to lantern light, let his eye trace Isaac's flowing script. When properly arranged, death speaks of tranquility greater than life itself. Those who observe will not perceive violence but design. The sheriff slammed the book shut. This is not a killer we hunt. This is an author. He planned his murders like lines of verse. Coroner Fitzgerald muttered, voice ragged. He thinks like a physician. No, worse. Like he aspired to be something beyond surgeon, beyond scientist. He writes about skin and blood as canvas. They glanced at Jonathan Peton, whose haunted eyes begged the question never to be asked aloud. Had the family been Isaac's livestock or his orchestra? The discovery of these journals planted a terror deeper than the massacre alone. For murder, however cruel, ends at bloodshed. But Isaac's mind revealed something longer, sustainable, a philosophy. He believed in the reworking of death into beauty. He wrote with the calm conviction of someone preparing to repeat, refine, expand. And with his disappearance into the hills of Virginia, holding this philosophy like fire, Isaac was not gone. He was evolving. The deeper the sheriff, coroner, and Dr. Jonathan delved into Isaac's journals, the less he resembled the plantation butcher they believed him to be. His sketches rivaled the plates pulled from anatomical atlases available only in libraries of physicians. His terminology mirrored that of medical schools, a technical vocabulary far away from fields and slaughterhouses. And then came the oral accounts, that single thread unraveling a much larger, darker tapestry. Not long after the journals were discovered, a blacksmith from Farmville named Samuel Woodson, a free man, came forward. His voice shook, but his eyes burned steady. He claimed he had known Isaac years earlier, not in bondage, not in Virginia, but in Philadelphia. According to Woodson, Isaac's true name had been Isaac Thornton. He had lived as a free man, light-skinned enough to be doubted at times, but with papers granting his status. And he had not been laboring in fields or slaughterhouses. He had been working inside the clinics of one of Philadelphia's more notorious physicians, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, anatomist, lecturer, and collector of cadavers. He knew more than many white men with degrees, Woodson declared, recalling Isaac's unnatural calm in surgical settings. His hands steady, his eyes cold. He didn't see people, not the way you or I do. He saw meat, layers, pieces to catalogue. To understand Isaac's possible origin in Philadelphia was to plunge into the darker currents of 19th century science. In the 1840s, Philadelphia boasted some of the leading anatomy schools in the United States. Students learned from cadavers, but cadavers rarely came by legal means. Grave robbing and body snatching were routine, especially from black cemeteries, the poor and the unclaimed dead. Physicians looked away so long as bodies were delivered. In this underworld of dissected corpses and illicit procurement, Isaac would have been surrounded by a culture that treated the human body as raw material. Imagine him standing at the dissecting table, scalpel gleaming under whale oil lamps, the skin of cadavers pulled back in folds. To most, this training led to healing, but to Isaac, every incision fed a fascination not with curing, but with structure itself. And unlike the medical men whose blood chilled before the humanity of the corpse, Isaac displayed no disturbance. His journals revealed drawings nearly identical to those taught within Philadelphia classrooms, cranial sutures sketched down to angle and proportion, muscular anatomy shaded to depth, vascular pathways detailed in accuracy. If Woodson's account bore truth, then Isaac had not only seen the stage of antebellum medicine, he had stood upon it, Woodson further recount. Ted, that his old acquaintance did not leave the Philadelphia Anatomy Hall with honor. He was expelled. Dr. Whitfield, his employer, had discovered Isaac conducting private experiments after hours in the anatomy laboratory. Dead subjects, bodies of the poor and enslaved, had been rearranged in grotesque tableaus. Where one cadaver ought to have been studied for textbook anatomy, Isaac posed it instead in unnerving positions, seated upright as if conversing, or disassembled and rebuilt in ways that reflected no science, only disturbing symbolism. Witnesses whispered he had begun speaking of dissections as art. Whitfield dismissed him immediately, enraged not merely by the offence but by the insubordination. Yet even dismissal did not stop him. Within weeks, city authorities investigated missing corpses from medical stores. Others were found tucked into abandoned homes, arranged in delicate, grotesque poses. Before Philadelphia sheriffs could question him, Isaac disappeared. It was here history frays into mystery. Did he flee south voluntarily? Was he mistaken for an escaped slave by hunters looking to profit? Was he sold deliberately into bondage under forged pretense? No certain record clarifies. But what is certain is that the Isaac who appeared 3 years later on Virginian plantations already carried with him the unnatural calm of a trained anatomist. Dr. Samuel Hutchinson, a physician from Prince Edward County who had treated Fielding Crawford's enslaved laborers before Isaac's sale, remembered him vividly. His memory stood out not for Isaac's behavior in the fields, but for his horrifying competence in surgical assistance. According to Hutchinson's private notes, Isaac often exhibited deeper knowledge of anatomy than his white peers. In emergencies, childbirth gone wrong, wounds festering, Hutchinson allowed Isaac a hand, if reluctantly. Each time Isaac moved with clinical precision, but without an ounce of human reaction, where another assistant might gag, shudder, or whisper sympathy for pain, Isaac stared with colorless eyes, wholly detached. To him, human groans were notes in an experiment, and suffering was reminder of the body as object, not person. Hutchinson also recorded his suspicions in the months before Isaac's sale. 3 enslaved individuals died under strange conditions. They appeared to have simply fallen into quiet sleep. Yet upon close inspection, Hutchinson found small puncture wounds, almost invisible behind each left ear. Their spinal columns had been nicked at a fatal point, enough to stop body functions instantly, with no thrash, no struggle. What farmer, what field slave, what butcher could strike with such exact knowledge? Only someone trained in anatomy. The kind of torment Isaac likely learned in laboratories, while others still naively believed in his servitude. When investigators in Cumberland joined this testimony to the journals, dread thickened. Isaac had not learned his skill in barns or hog pens. He had not been a mere brute sharpened by slaughter. He was a ghost of 2 worlds, science and slavery both. His hands bore the education of dissection rooms that the South believed forever barred to men like him. Yet his body had been cast into slavery, a contradiction that turned his mind bitterly inward until his fascination shifted from observation to performance. At Peaton Grove, he had not created art in vacuum. He had been evolving an obsession birthed in Philadelphia morgues under the quiet glow of anatomy lamps long before his name became Isaac the Butcher. But then another riddle clawed its way forward. Was Isaac Thornton even real? No church record of his baptism was ever found in Philadelphia. No official register carried his birth in Virginia. No family name claimed him as son. Samuel Woodson swore to his memory, but others denied ever having seen him among the free black community of Philadelphia. Had Isaac invented Thornton as mask? Had he been someone else entirely, educated white man of mixed heritage slipping unnoticed into slave trade? Or was he truly a free man, stripped of papers and dragged south, forced into bondage yet carrying with him the education of autopsies? No certainty, only fragments, as elusive as his pale grey eyes behind which no one ever seemed to glimpse a soul. What investigators now feared was not just the massacre itself, it was its implication. That Isaac was the product of 2 horrors entwined, the brutality of slavery and the cold detachment of scientific exploitation. That he was not anomaly, but symptom. That in a world where the poor, the enslaved, and the forgotten bodies of the dead could be carved up for knowledge, someone like Isaac could emerge. Isaac had brought the dark underside of Philadelphia science deep into Virginia's fields, and in Peaton Grove's parlor rooms, in its nursery, in its kitchens, he staged what he once rehearsed in Philadelphia morgues. Except now, his audience was no longer silent cadavers, but the living forced into articulate death. By the close of this revelation, Virginia authorities realized they were not hunting a slave on the run. They were chasing a man who had already stood in the halls of medicine, who had been polished by education but warped by obsession. And with his journals mentioning disciples beyond Virginia, the troubling question arose, what if Isaac had already planted seeds of his philosophy before becoming the Butcher? This was no isolated monster. This was possibly a movement gestating at society's edge. The whispers of Piton Grove had not cooled before terror kindled anew. Rumours stretched across Cumberland, Buckingham and Powhatan counties, livestock found butchered and arranged in obscene shapes, enslaved people discovered with the familiar puncture behind he ear, entire households uneasy at noises in the night. Isaac, they said, walked the back roads of Virginia not as fugitive but as shadow, seen one moment, vanished the next. Then came the Randolph plantation. The Randolph estate was one of the Commonwealth's proudest. The family traced its lineage back to the 17th century, their grand colonial mansion standing as symbol of wealth older than many of the nation's towns. Whitewashed brick, sprawling wings, expansive ballrooms, fountains and orchards dotting acres. Families like the Randolphs fancied themselves nobility, removed from turbulence by honor and God, but in the spring of 1847 the Randolph mansion became Virginia's most infamous crime scene. Sheriff Thomas Hawthorne and a retinue of deputies arrived after the patriarch, Colonel William Randolph, sent desperate riders into the night crying for assistance. What they discovered surpassed even Piton Grove. In the main parlor, 17 members of the Randolph household sat upright at the long mahogany dining table. At first glance, it was a formal supper frozen in time, the candles still burning, shadows flickering golden. Each figure wore garments of society dinner, silverware glinted, porcelain gleamed, goblets caught the candlelight. But where bread or fruit should have been, the plates bore severed human heads. Each family member's head had been placed carefully before their respective body. Their eyes stared blankly across the table at one another, mouths shaped in silence, as though forever locked in conversation. The arrangement was so precise that Colonel Randolph had to be physically dragged from the room before madness overtook him, but the dining room was nothing compared to the scene awaiting in the ballroom. There, investigators found 32 enslaved men and women posed in dance. Their bodies stood upright, held in place by wires, ropes, and carefully measured balances. They had been arranged in pairs, spinning arm in arm, as if captured in the midst of an eternal waltz. Isaac had dressed some in garments stripped from the dead Randolph family, intertwining enslaved and enslaver in a dance the living world would never sanction. Heads had been mismatched deliberately. The overseer's corpse spun in grotesque grace with the body of a young woman whose head was replaced by a Randolph daughter. A grandmotherly slave's body bore the head of a child, grinning at waist height. Each pairing was an abomination, yet executed with precision suggesting hours, possibly days, of methodical work. Deputies stood in unnatural stillness, hands over their mouths, unable to step farther. They swore the ballroom still carried faint echoes of music, the imagined strains of violin Isaac had never bothered to play, now conjured only by dreadful suggestion. The horror reached its crescendo beneath the mansion. Hidden in the Randolph estate's root cellar lay what investigators realized was nothing short of a laboratory. There, on wooden benches, rested surgical instruments stolen from physicians or crafted with a blacksmith's aid. Crude diagrams of human musculature littered the tables. Anatomical sketches crowded the walls, some chalked directly onto stone, others slipped into journals, showing new ideas for arrangement. Most shocking were the tools clearly designed for live use, restraint devices built to keep a body immobile while procedures were inflicted. Some victims bore marks of experiments that had not intended to kill them instantly. Their wounds suggested Isaac and his followers, yes, by now it was certain he had followers helping him, had conducted trials on awareness itself. Testing, Coroner Fitzgerald whispered, pale under his spectacles, to measure pain, consciousness, to hold the body alive long enough to orchestrate its final pose. The laboratory contained fresh supplies untouched, indicating that Isaac and his group had been poised to move on. Horrifyingly, shoe prints and evidence of multiple hands, arranging ropes and tools, confirmed what the journals had hinted. Isaac had disciples. His philosophy was not his own invention alone. Witness accounts in the countryside soon confirmed this. A Catholic priest recounted meeting a band of itinerant preachers traveling roads days earlier, led by a tall man with pale eyes who spoke of death as resurrection. The priest suspected immediately that this was Isaac himself, cloaking murder in theology. With him, 2 men of African descent and 1 unmistakably white. All spoke with reverent obedience to their leader's grotesque vision. The Randolph Ballroom bore their signatures. 4 perpetrators could have achieved such a gallery in the short span of a single night. Isaac had taught them his philosophy, and worse, his discipline. When Hawthorne realized the scale, his voice broke for the first time in his career. This is not a crime, but a campaign. This was massacre elevated to message. Isaac had not simply taken vengeance on Piton Grove, he had delivered a sermon of flesh to the entire Commonwealth, and in that ballroom of death, any illusion of plantation security evaporated. The Randolph estate, like Piton Grove before it, had been infiltrated from within, its walls turned into Isaac's theater stage. On a table at the far end of the laboratory lay a final document, 1 more of Isaac's journals. It contained sketches for what he called his next composition, planned to coincide with a neighboring family's grand dinner party. It was clear Isaac did not intend to vanish quietly. He intended encore upon encore, each bloodier and more elaborate, sweeping plantation after plantation until Virginia itself trembled beneath his masterpiece of mortality. By the time the sun lowered on the ruins of the Randolph family's glory, Isaac was no longer merely spoken of as runaway murderer. He was phantom, he was blasphemer, he was the aesthetic of death given living form, and to every sheriff and planter now bolting their doors at dusk, he was one thing above all: unstoppable. The massacre at Randolph left Virginia paralyzed with fear. Families who once laughed at the idea of locking their doors now barred them with crossbeams at dusk. Planters posted armed sentries along verandas and patrols through orchards as though they lived under siege. Yet to Isaac, these gestures of defense only sharpened the theater. He no longer needed merely to kill, he meant to show. And his next scene would be staged at Carrington Plantation. The Carringtons, relatives of the Randolphs by marriage, were hosts to gentry from across Cumberland County. Colonel James Carrington, veteran of the War of 1812, enjoyed hosting military comrades and planter families alike. A dinner party had been arranged weeks in advance, to unfold in March's last evening. What the Carringtons never knew was that Isaac had already marked the date in his journals. Investigators would later uncover, among Randolph's cellar papers, a detailed plan for the Carrington dinner, notes on seating arrangements, sketches of the dining hall, even a schedule based on servants' habits. To Isaac, Carrington's hospitality was no coincidence of convenience. It was stagecraft. By now, Sheriff Hawthorne and authorities across 5 counties coordinated desperate pursuit. Scouts rode by day, searching roads, barns, abandoned mills, yet Isaac remained invisible, as if he dissolved into Virginia's landscape. His movements left false trails, his knowledge of anatomy extending even to tricking hounds, masking scents with herbs, diverting pursuit with planted garments. So, Hawthorne laid his own plan. If Isaac intended to strike Carrington, then the dinner itself would become bait. Armed officers surrounded the property, muskets concealed, eyes sharp on the tobacco dusk. Colonel Carrington insisted the event proceed as though nothing were amiss. Decim, Laring. If terror commands us to collapse, then he has already triumphed. Guests arrived in silks and uniforms, a dozen family members, and their companions dined while nearly 30 armed men crouched in darkness outside. It was a play, a feast within, vigilance without. But Isaac rewrote their script. The guests murmured, lifting glasses of port, when Elizabeth Carrington's ear caught an odd detail. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. A faint scratching, subtle at first, then firmer, like claws raking the belly of the house itself. It came from beneath the dining room floorboards. Before anyone could investigate, wood groaned, boards trembled, and then, like devils erupting from underworld, the floor split open. 4 figures rose from the darkness. Isaac had tunneled beneath Carrington's mansion, working unseen days in advance, his disciples beside him. What emerged through the torn planks stunned the guests into paralysis. Isaac's once orderly appearance had devolved. His pale eyes shone with manic light, his hair grown wild, his coat stained in substances no one cared to identify. Yet his motions were graceful, almost priestly. He raised his hands calmly, directing his 3 followers forward like a conductor poised before orchestra. Two disciples appeared to be formerly enslaved, faces flushed with fanatical allegiance. The third was unmistakably white, a man of the overseer class, his acceptance of Isaac's philosophy proving more chilling than the knives he carried. Each wielded sharpened instruments, gleaming even in candlelight. There would be no secret posing tonight. Isaac meant this slaughter to unfold with eyes watching. Chaos unfurled. Guests screamed, scrambling from chairs, only to be forced back at blade's point. Muskets outside could not fire into the room without risking the lives of every host and guest within. The deputies clenched their rifles, helpless to intervene as the dining chamber became Isaac's stage. And so he performed. He did not kill at first. Instead, with chilling calm, Isaac began, speaking. He spoke of death not as horror, but as liberation, one final transformation that unites all, planter and enslaved alike, in the ultimate art. He told of how flesh poses more truth in silence than mouths ever utter when alive. He gestured to his captives with reverence, not rage. Each one, he said, would soon become part of a greater tableau, an arrangement that would reveal beauty they could not yet perceive. His words came like sermon, patient, certain, weaving dread into every mind that heard them. Guests sobbed quietly as he invited them to study two figures he had already slain, posed against the dining room wall to mimic laughter mid-toast, heads resting gently in cups as if they had completed their drink in death. You see, Isaac intoned with awful gentleness, the soul vacates the body, but the body remains, perfect for composition. Is this not eternal conversation between flesh and eternity? His disciples nodded reverently, their silence punctuating credence. For nearly 2 hours, Isaac staged his theater, positioning guests, rearranging corpses, forcing his dinner audience to examine his work. He demanded they utter what they perceived in his art. Most could not speak through terror. Some fainted, others begged for mercy. Through it all, Isaac hovered less like criminal than like maestro, interpreting every gesture of fear as part of his composition. He observed with eyes drained of compassion but alight with conviction. Amid this dreadful theater sat Colonel Carrington, jaw clenched, knuckles pressed upon his dining table. Drawing on his soldiers' discipline, he enacted the prearranged signal, tilting his wine glass at precise angle, repositioning hands like insignia. Outside, through narrow gaps in shutters, Sheriff Hawthorne and his men saw it. The attackers had shifted unintentionally into formation, Isaac lecturing at head of tay. Blee, his 3 disciples positioned evenly around, their geometry unironically perfect to Isaac, exposed their vulnerability. In a sudden explosion of wood and glass, Sheriff's men stormed through doors and windows, muskets flashing. Smoke filled the parlor. Isaac turned, not in panic but in rapture, throwing his arms wide as lead slammed into his chest. Bullets ripped him back, staggering across tableware. His eyes, those eerie pale eyes, remained locked on his audience till the moment he collapsed. His disciples attempted to resist, seizing chairs and captives, but lawmen surrounded the house swiftly, musket balls shredding them in flashes of smoke. In seconds, the tableau Isaac had meant to direct concluded instead in his own blood upon Carrington's polished floor. When the gunpowder cleared, Isaac lay sprawled across velvet carpet, his blood fanning outward beneath him like crimson halo. Around him, his disciples shuddered in silence, lifeless marionettes whose strings had been cut. Guests gasped shuddering sobs, some half-convinced death itself had been seated among them. And in irony, no one present would easily erase the parlor itself, filled with corpses of disciples, panic-stilled guests, tipped chairs, and shattered windows, looked eerily like one of Isaac's own compositions, violent chaos frozen into a strange moment of visual order. The man who had sought to stage death as art had become unwilling subject of the final masterpiece. Isaac the Butcher was dead. The siege sent waves across Virginia. Peton Grove might have been isolated tragedy. Randolph could have been dismissed as monstrosity with disciples. But Carrington was different. There had been witnesses, planters, officers, families of stature, who not only survived, but heard Isaac's sermons aloud for hours. His philosophy of death as art was no mere rumor. It had been spoken, sermonized, pressed alive into trembling ears. And though Isaac lay dead, the terror he created did not die with him. For his journals, his tokens, His letters already hinted at disciples across counties, perhaps even beyond Virginia. The body of Isaac Thornton, known in Nightmare as Isaac the Butcher, had fallen, yet his idea still wandered free. Isaac's pale eyes closed forever on the dining room floor of Carrington Plantation. His chest, riddled with musket balls, rose and fell once, then stilled. Lawmen exhaled relief through smoke-choked lungs. Guests collapsed into sobbing embraces. For the first time in months, Cumberland County felt the terror had ended. But the relief was short-lived. When the sheriff's men combed Isaac's body, they found no gold, no tokens of identity, only the faint stains of ink on his hands, as if even in the days before his death he had been writing. His disciples' bodies revealed nothing but fanatic devotion etched in their blank stares. Yet beneath Carrington Plantation, in the satchels the intruders carried, investigators found something worse than knives. They found letters. The letters, dense in Isaac's script and written in multiple hands, suggested that he had not been ideologue alone. He had been recruiter. Correspondence stretched outward from Virginia into North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and even hints of Maryland. Words referred to brothers and sisters who perceive beauty in cessation, to the flock in waiting, and to the theatre to be unveiled in other halls. Some were answers to letters Isaac had written, praising him, confirming imitation of his method, speaking with deference. Your arrangements inspire. We attempt, as you outlined, the wound behind the ear, nearly invisible, most efficient. Sickeningly, these words described practice murders elsewhere, killing enslaved men and women in precisely the same signature style. The philosophy had traveled even where Isaac himself had not. For Sheriff Hawthorne, the implication landed heavier than Isaac's body itself. This was never a man, he muttered grimly. This was a doctrine with a knife. Isaac had, by charisma or cold rationality, convinced others to view human life as artistic material. And his training, mechanical, anatomical, psychological, allowed him to pass those lessons on like a professor tutoring obsessed students. Authorities scrambled across counties to match Isaac's journals with local reports. In Buckingham County, livestock had been arranged in crude geometric patterns weeks before Randolph. In Chesterfield, families whispered of sudden deaths in slave quarters, no cause evident, bodies lying too peacefully. In Nottoway, a plantation household had vanished altogether. Home abandoned, no sign of violence, but later investigation uncovered diagrams inside barns etched in chalk, matching Isaac's style. Each clue whispered the same underlying fact. Isaac had been only one part of a larger phantom body, scattered, multiplying, invisible. Even beyond the hunt for these disciples, Isaac left a scar across planter society. Plantation owners, long confident in their control, felt suddenly naked. The Peton and Randolph massacres had shown that wealth, guards, and bloodlines could be undone by one man working in silence. Worse still, he had undone them without noise, leaving polished parlors pristine but families obliterated. And so panic set in. Neighbors looked suspiciously not just at their enslaved workers, but at fellow planters. Could Isaac's creed have seduced free men? Overseers, poor whites, had even educated physicians given ear to his writings. His correspondence showed at least one white man had stood at his side in Carrington's dining room, lending his knife to the same gospel. The fear itself became legacy. It wasn't enough to kill Isaac. His shadow fused itself into social suspicion. The Commonwealth sealed the official report to avoid inflaming unrest. But rumors do not heed chains. They spread on winds and rivers, and by the summer of 1847, Isaac the Butcher had transformed into folklore. Some called him a demon, some swore he never died, that Hawthorne's shots felled a double, that Isaac slid away into hills under another face. Folk tales sprouted that he vanished into caves, took to marshes, became preacher, even boarded ships southward to Haiti to spread the philosophy of the blade. But none doubted that his writings lived. Families kept them hidden, authorities burned some, but others circulated in shadow. Whispers told of children, orphaned of Isaac's massacres, who grew up retelling the horror in hushed kitchens, and the spectre of his disciples loomed. Arrests followed in the next year. In Richmond, a butcher was caught arranging livestock with eerie precision. In Carolina, a farmhand vanished with surgical instruments stolen from his master. Each case, whether copycat or genuine follower, reanimated the dread. Isaac was dead, but the butcher's philosophy still roamed in living hands. Isaac's terror forced slaveholding Virginia to confront truths it had long denied. The myth of the docile, ignorant, enslaved man collapsed under Isaac's profile. Here had been one who observed, who calculated, who turned knowledge invisible to owners into a weapon sharper than any overseer's whip. If Isaac could wield education learned in shadows, how many more enslaved bodies could? If one man could hold entire counties in fear, what of many? In taverns and courthouses, planters spoke of Isaac not just as killer, but as symbol of their deepest anxieties. Not anger, but intelligence in bondage. Not revolt in open field, but knife in shadow, head severed clean at desk. Plantation society would never unlearn the lesson he carved into Virginia's history. Their world rested on false assumptions, and now on fragile glass. To historians who later unearthed the sealed reports, one conclusion thrummed within every page. Isaac was not anomaly, he was vanguard. Whether his disciples truly carried on murders in distant counties, or whether the fear itself filled in blanks with imagination, the effect was the same. His letters described a network across the South, fragmented, perhaps delusional, but real enough to terrify. No arrest records listed Isaac Thornton, no identity confirmed him. He was man and myth, one who may have assumed multiple names, teaching art of death to those longing for it, and with his death, the legend only multiplied. In Carrington's dining room, his final performance closed with bullets, but in the minds of Virginians, slave and free, planter and pauper, physician and preacher, the play never ended. Isaac's curtain fall became merely an echo. His disciples lingered just off stage, and so his name did not fade. It drifted outward as warning, whispered in homes and fields, written in shadows of journals hidden in trunks. Isaac the Butcher was only the beginning. Virginia wanted to forget Isaac. The reports were buried, the journals sealed, the letters burned. His name invoked unease at dinner tables. Families shifted uncomfortably whenever someone whispered it in rural taverns. The authorities declared the case closed, the man dead, justice done. But Isaac the Butcher did not vanish into burial dirt beside the Carrington home. He remained alive in memory, in gossip, in fear. And fear is the most enduring monster of them all. Nothing about Isaac belonged to phantom tales, though in time Virginians would retell his story as if he possessed otherworldly powers. They said hounds lost his scent because he had no soul. They said his pale eyes paralyzed men where they stood. They said he did not bleed when struck, which was false, but somehow easier to believe than the truth. The truth was more terrifying. He was human. Every drop of horror sprang not from devils or hexes, but from deliberate thought. Isaac had taken human intelligence, observation, patience, discipline, the very qualities lauded by planters for themselves, and used them as sharpened tools. He did not rage blindly. He studied, he practiced, he dissected, he arranged. That was why his story lingered in memory, because his evil came not from madness, but from reason unmoored from morality. For Virginia's planter class, Isaac was a mirror they wished to shatter. His story revealed the greatest lie of their society, the belief that enslaved people lacked intellect, that bondage erased ambition, that human beings stripped of freedom lived only as docile instruments of their master's order. Yet Isaac had proven that enslaved life teemed with observation, with strategy, with silent patience. His massacre was not rebellion fueled by rage, but rebellion fueled by understanding people as deeply as their diaries, their steps, their fears. The implication rattled every planter, that any enslaved person could be watching with the same intensity, that behind silent faces were not empty minds, but sharp ones, waiting. What makes Isaac unique in the annals of American violence is not the number of people he killed, though that number by conservative count eclipsed 100 across counties. It was the philosophy he left in his wake. He did not write of escape. He did not speak of freedom. He wrote of arrangement. He viewed people the way an artist sees clay, the way an architect sees stone. Death fascinated him not as end, but as new beginning, a silence he could sculpt into order. His journals were horrifying precisely because they were articulate. Anyone can kill. Isaac reasoned about it, dressed it in language, elevated it into grotesque art. That thought would bedevil physicians who read his notes after the war. That a mind long thought unworthy of education had produced the darkest education of all. And though Isaac died, his shadow outlived him. His writing proved portable, his ideas malleable. They traveled quietly, disguised in rumor, magnified in the paranoia of slave-holding households already fearful of revolt. Did his disciples truly spread terror through Carolina and Georgia? Or did fear force every unexplained death into Isaac's shape? No one can say. But the uncertainty itself proved haunting. Sometimes fear does not need armies, only the possibility of them. The very suggestion of Isaac's network planted paranoia deep into the soil of the Old South. Planters adopted stricter surveillance, harsher codes, constant vigilance. But the cost of vigilance is suspicion, and suspicion slowly rotted their confidence from within. Thus, Isaac the Butcher may have cut more deeply into Virginia than even his knives had allowed. His true legacy was doubt, that no world built on chains could ever truly call itself secure. When later generations unearthed the sealed reports, Isaac's tale begged a question as old as evil itself. How does a man become monster? The answer lies not in phantom possession or curses. It lies in the collision of systems, slavery and science, cruelty and intellect, oppression and obsession. Isaac had been forged by contradictions, a free man turned slave, a butcher turned anatomist, a trained observer too, turned artist of death. What he revealed, whether intended or not, is that horror requires no supernatural spark. It lives wherever power disregards humanity, wherever systems treat people as bodies before they treat them as souls. The greatest monsters are not wolves cloaked in fantasy. They are men, calm, deliberate, rational, who convince themselves that cruelty is order, that death is design, that butchery is beauty. And so the story of Isaac closes with unease. His body was torn apart by musket fire in 1847, but his name, the name scrawled into whispers, remained. A reminder in Virginia's hidden history that not all horrors belong to ghost stories. Some walk in daylight, sharpen knives at dusk, and wait for the perfect patience of silence. Isaac's curtain dropped, yet his shadow lingers across centuries, a symbol of knowledge perverted into cruelty, of human systems blind to their own fragility, of what happens when order fuels its own undoing. And perhaps that is the final horror of Isaac the Butcher, that even stripped of myth, the man himself was enough.